Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing part 2 of my yearly Q&A. Let us jump right into it with the first question coming from Null, who asks, will the San Jose Sharks have a captain this season, and if so, who will it end up being? I would say that the Sharks will probably end up with a captain this year. Obviously, there's no guarantee, but a pretty high chance. The reason why they didn't have one this past season is because technically it was still Logan Couture, despite the fact that he did not play a single game with the Sharks that year. But the thing is that now that Couture has essentially announced his retirement, I would say that that is the green light to finally be able to pass the torch to somebody else. If it were up to me, I would give the captaincy to Macklin Celebrini. I think everybody is well aware of the fact that he would eventually end up with it within the next couple of years, and so I say why not pull the band-aid off right away and do it now. However, the Sharks might try to slow play it a little bit. I just don't think that there's really an optimal choice if that is your decision. There's Mario Ferraro, who certainly has a ton of leadership qualities, but the thing is that he might not even still be with the team by the time the year does end. Barclay Goodrow is a player who is really much liked by the organization and the coaching staff, but as a fringe fourth liner, does he really get that captaincy? Probably not. And then Tyler Toffoli is likely that next best option after Celebrini, but the thing is that Toffoli is locked in with the Sharks for the next 3 seasons because of that no movement clause, and I don't think the Sharks would ever want to strip the captaincy from Toffoli. And so are we willing to slow play it for a full 3 seasons before Celebrini actually does get that C on his chest? Probably not, in my opinion. And so I think, this wouldn't be setting a crazy precedent. There have been other franchise cornerstone players who have received the captaincy at such a young age and then went on to have extremely successful careers on extremely successful teams. And I think Celebrini is prepared to handle that responsibility. So I would say he is probably the best choice. The next question comes from Jonah, who asks, if the Sharks were to fire their head coach, who would they pick up to replace him and why? Now, coming up with an actual exact name is rather difficult because the thing is that I don't think Warsofsky would get fired immediately during the season unless the Sharks were to open the year with like 15 straight losses and the Sharks were forced to make some sort of change. I would think Warsofsky would be given an entire year to actually figure things out here, and if the Sharks do end up repeating in last place, maybe then he would end up getting fired. And the reason this is important to mention is because over the course of a season, there are going to be always a handful of head coaches who do get fired, especially this year. So many teams are looking to take a step forward, they're looking to improve, and yet there are still only a limited 16 playoff spots in the NHL. So there's going to be a lot of organizations who end up coming in below expectations and likely doing the easiest thing that they can, which is firing their head coach. And the thing is that I think if the Sharks were to fire Warsofsky, they would pick up someone with a lot more experience. They would not want to go down the kind of inexperienced head coach, NHL head coach, I should say, route again like they did with Warsofsky. So I don't think they'd go for like an AHL guy or anything like that. They'd probably pick up someone who is much more proven at this top level, and it might even be one of the guys who would end up getting fired this upcoming season. So while I don't have an exact name, that is the direction I think that the Sharks would end up going with. The next question comes from Supreme Fallacy, who asks or points out that the Sharks have some pretty major issues on defense. That's not exactly anything out of anything of a surprise, I would say. But the question is, how will they go about addressing this? Is this going to be improved through the draft, or are they going to be able to improve this through free agency and trade? And the thing is that as the Sharks are now approaching the end of their rebuild, actually addressing this defensive issue through the draft becomes a lot more difficult. Perhaps the Sharks will end up getting another high draft pick this season, let's say in that top 5, and they're able to use it to pick up a really good defenseman who could make the jump to the NHL within the next year or 2. But if that doesn't end up being the case, as you kind of pick these defenseman players in the late first and then even later on into the second and the third round, they have a much longer timeline before they're able to make much of an impact at that NHL level. Just look at Shakir Mukhamadullin, who was a late first-round pick by the New Jersey Devils back in 2020. He is only making a full-time NHL debut this season about 5 years later. And so the long term can still be improved through the draft, but the short term improvements on the blue line will likely have to come through trade or through free agency. For the San Jose Sharks, about specific targets here, it's definitely hard to say, and it goes back to what I mentioned in my part 1, which is you kind of have to play it by ear. You have to be opportunistic when the opportunities do pop up for yourself, because as much as you can look ahead and say, okay, this guy's going to be a UFA at the end of this season, there's a high likelihood that that player will end up re-signing with the team he is currently on, especially as the salary cap continues to go up so aggressively. Teams have a lot more space to work with. We saw that Aaron Ekblad, Neil Pionk were going to be very interesting possible free agent signings this offseason, and yet Ekblad went back with the Florida Panthers, Neil Pionk went back with the Winnipeg Jets, and the Sharks were not really left with many great options. And so in terms of free agency, you just have to wait until you're getting really close to July 1st before you look to make that push. And the same thing kind of goes with trade. Yes, you could look at defensemen across the league and say, I want that guy and I want that guy. But if the other team isn't actually willing to trade that player, you can't really do much about it. And so you have to wait for the opportunities when they do come up, like the Montreal Canadiens were able to do when they acquired Noah Dobson from the New York Islanders. But it should be noted that the Sharks, they'll need to try to make a big swing here on the blue line if they really want to be able to take this team to the next level. The next question was actually asked by a few different people, and it basically surrounds the fact that is Mike Grier the general manager who can build this team into not just a competitor, but into a Stanley Cup winning team? Because some of the moves that he has made as of late have begun to bring up a few question marks. For instance, the Henry Thrun for Ryan Reeves trade, or in particular, the Fabian Zetterlund trade that sent him to Ottawa to get back Zach Ostapchuk. And indeed, there have been some pretty questionable moves here by Mike Grier, but there has also been a lot of positives over these last few seasons, and enough positives that I would say he is deserving of the confidence from San Jose Sharks fans to say that he can be the person to take this team to that next level, to that competitive type of area. He has built up this team through the draft and has done a very good job of it. And while that Fabian Zetterlund trade, for instance, does not look particularly good at all on paper, it's not as though Zetterlund was projected to be an incredibly important piece for the San Jose Sharks. At best, you were probably looking at a good third liner, but in terms of the top 6, it has been through the draft that has been established. Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, Misa, probably Chernyshov as well. There's already 5 players. The 6th could be some sort of, rotation, either Musty or Graf, or perhaps even some sort of free agent signing as well, as most teams don't usually build up an entire top 6 of drafted players. The Sharks are quite set at that top level in terms of forwards. Zetterlund, it's a loss, but not a significant one just yet. So I don't think Mike Grier has made such a terrible move that has really hurt the future of this San Jose Sharks team. Things are mostly still heading in the right direction, and so I think giving him the next couple of years to be able to figure things out is the right way to go, and we can really only hope at this point, considering there's no past to go on with Mike Grier. This is his first general manager job at the NHL level. We can only just hope that he'll be able to figure things out, but stopping him at the halfway mark of his actual plan that he's had since he came in doesn't really make a lot of sense. So you let him do it, and hopefully it does work out. The next question comes from Evil Ducks, who asks, is it detrimental to have players like Michael Misa and Sam Dickinson in the NHL this year, perhaps in over their head, compared to having them play in the OHL, where they would be significantly better than the rest of their competition? Now, when it comes to Michael Misa, I would say it is much better to have him in the NHL, because as a forward, he can be kind of sheltered a lot more than a defenseman would be, and so he'll still be able to kind of play in some offensive zone situations, maybe some power plays, to be able to find some success at that NHL level, and it is definitely much better than him skating circles around the OHL yet again and just putting up an absurd point total. So for me, Misa, it makes a lot more sense to have him in the NHL. The NCAA would be a different story, but that's not really the consideration here. The thing with Dickinson, I could see a little bit more pause, because as a defenseman, even in sheltered minutes, at some point he's going to be asked to defend at the NHL level, and that is not an easy thing to do, and there will be mistakes, and there will be games where he does not look particularly good, and perhaps his confidence will be shaken. However, I think there are so many other benefits here that come not just from on ice in the NHL, but also off of it. He gets to really get familiar with his future teammates. Players like Celebrini and Smith, you're developing that chemistry rather early on. He gets acclimated to the rigorous travel schedule of an NHL team, especially one like the San Jose Sharks, who always has a ton of miles each season compared to other teams in the league, as well as much more so than any OHL team would have in a particular season. And he also gets the benefit of the just NHL level staff, coaching staff, training staff, medical, athletic, all of that, much higher up than even a prestigious organization like the London Knights in the OHL. And not to mention the fact being able to just simply absorb information and knowledge from more veteran players like Toffoli and Wenberg, but even younger guys who have been in his situation quite recently, like Celebrini and Smith and Eklund, is going to be extremely valuable compared to being the most experienced player on a London Knights team filled with like 16 and 17-year-olds, especially since the Knights have lost so many players to kind of moving through up and out of that league that they might be going through a little bit of a rebuild. Sam Dickinson might not even be able to have the same team type of success as he had these past couple of seasons. So to me, the NHL, yes, it's kind of the best of a bad situation. It would be best for him to be in the AHL with the San Jose Barracuda, but since that is not an option, I think the NHL is definitely the better landing destination for him. The next question comes from 9Gang, who asks, will the San Jose Sharks regret trading Thomas Bordeleau and or Danil Gushchin? Can both of these players end up becoming legit top 6 guys in the NHL? And the answer is technically yes. I mean, they certainly could end up going on to become top 6 players. I wouldn't necessarily bet on it, however. Thomas Bordeleau, to me, I would say would maybe at best become like a Kevin Labanc style of guy, where he can be that power play specialist, very good in that area, but can't quite handle the top 6 minutes in the NHL, so he plays more in like a sheltered third line role. That would still be pretty valuable, but nothing crazy to be missing out on. Danil Gushchin, I would say, has the slightly higher ceiling, especially being in Colorado. They might really be able to unlock his potential, and he could become a relatively productive player in the league. But the thing is that looking at these players who the Sharks have now already traded, you don't really want to be looking at in the past. You want to be looking forward at the young players that the Sharks still do have, not really worrying about anything else. And so yes, maybe there will be some regret with both of these guys. Maybe there will be some moments where you're thinking the Sharks should not have traded these players, but you kind of just want to keep staring ahead and focus on what the Sharks still do have, which is an extremely enviable position compared to most other NHL teams when it comes to their prospect pool. The next question comes from John, who asks, are there other players this season who are in a similar type of last chance year compared to last year with Bordeleau and Gushchin? I would say that there are a couple of names that do pop up here, guys who are in like that 22, 23 year age range who are on expiring contracts. The first of which would be Ethan Cardwell. Now he is in a slightly different spot than Bordeleau and Gushchin were, because while those two players were like these undersized, likely needing to be top 9 forwards in the NHL, having to fit into that particular situation, Ethan Cardwell is a lot more flexible. He's a guy who could be a 4th liner, so even if that breakout moment doesn't happen this year, I think there is a world where Mike Grier is willing to bring him back on like a 1-year contract to see if he can sort of do it the next season, and I think Cardwell would be willing to agree to that. So I don't think this is like a fully last chance. However, one name that definitely fits more so this description would actually be Jack Thompson. In fact, he might not even play this year with the San Jose Sharks. If they decide to have him on waivers, it is very possible that he gets picked up by a different team, and so this isn't even a conversation to be had. But if he does stick around within the organization, I'm honestly not entirely sure how many games he's really going to get, and you'd likely think he has to be playing a decent amount for the Sharks to want to hang on to him. And so there's a pretty good chance, I would say, probably more so than not, that Jack Thompson is no longer with the Sharks by this time next year. The next question comes from Yori, who asks, why are the San Jose Sharks such big fans of Barclay Goodrow as a player? Well, the big thing I would say is the kind of leadership qualities that he supposedly brings to the team, the intangibles there, the fact that he won a couple of Stanley Cups while honestly serving a pretty good role on that Tampa Bay Lightning team. That type of experience is supposed to be able to help out and rub off on some of the younger players within the San Jose Sharks organization. And that much, it's hard to really refute. I don't have the behind-the-scenes knowledge to be able to go against that. However, there are on-ice opinions as well from the Sharks coaching staff that I can disagree with, because Ryan Warsofsky was asked this question of what Goodrow brought to the table near the end of this past season, and there were 2 answers that he did bring up. One thing was actually being able to help out some of the younger players on the face-off dot, which I found very surprising because, first of all, Goodrow's face-off percentage this season was completely terrible, like I think at around 42%, much worse than many other players on that Sharks roster. Yeah, and even if you look at his entire career, he's only at about a 50%, so still not that great. And then when it comes, the second thing that Warsofsky had said was that he could help out the team defensively from imparting that knowledge as well to the younger players. And indeed, Goodrow was good in this area a few years ago, but if they're going to be taking any tips from him this season compared to what he does on the ice this season, Goodrow was one of the worst players statistically in this particular area. And so he's not really bringing a ton of value on the ice, but the Sharks coaching staff does seem to think that he is, and as well those leadership qualities, I guess, are what it manages to keep him into the lineup night in and night out. The next question comes from Jonah, who asks, what is the future of Patrick Giles on this San Jose Sharks team? And this is a very interesting one because when Giles was originally acquired from the Florida Panthers in the Vitek Vanacek trade, you didn't really think much of him. It seemed like it was just a move to try and get Vanacek into a better environment, and indeed he ended up winning a Stanley Cup, so I'm sure he's very thankful of that trade being made by the San Jose Sharks. But Giles came in and was actually rather solid for the Sharks and for the organization as a whole. He was tasked with some fourth-line minutes that he had success in, some third-line minutes that he had success in, and then when he got sent down to the San Jose Barracuda, he still played rather well for them through the rest of the regular season and was one of their better forwards in the playoffs too. And I had thought, because of all of these factors, that he might be able to find his way onto the Sharks starting roster for this upcoming season. However, with all of the moves that the Sharks have made here, with picking up Skinner and Gaudette and Kurashev, as well as the fact that there is a pretty good chance that Michael Misa does start this year with the San Jose Sharks, it doesn't really feel as though there's many spaces for Giles to actually be starting this season in the NHL. And so to me, I think Giles will probably just end up being a Barracuda player this year. Maybe there will be some major injuries that allow him to be the call-up, but I think that they might look at a guy like Ethan Cardwell or even Cam Lund as an earlier call-up than Patrick Giles, and so I don't really think that there's much of a future for him here, despite the fact that he did play rather well. Hopefully there will be a different team at that point that signs him. I believe he's a UFA at the end of this season, and maybe he'll find an opportunity there. He does have some decent promise. The next question comes from a couple of people, which was pertaining to William Eklund. Basically, that is William Eklund a player who the Sharks will be willing to trade to try and get some help on their defense? One person asked, is the fact that William Eklund signed a bridge deal here for 3 seasons an indication that the Sharks are more willing to actually trade him away? And another person asked whether or not William Eklund would be a player who could get traded to a contender to try and bring back a really good defenseman. And when you combine both of these, it's basically, will Eklund get traded? And I will say that of all of the players on the San Jose Sharks, there are a few kind of untouchables, very, very, very unlikely to get moved, guys like Celebrini and Smith. I would say Eklund is probably the highest value asset that the Sharks do have, outside of maybe their first round pick of this season, that they would be willing to move. But the thing is that the price does have to be very good for it to happen. It's not going to be about futures. It's not going to be about prospects who are a couple years away or draft picks or anything like that. If they're going to be trading William Eklund, they're going to be getting back a very good top 4 and maybe even somewhat close to being top pairing defenseman, because Eklund does have a ton of value. This is a player who can put up 60 points while also being responsible in his own end. There's a lot there as a player. Now, will he end up going to a contending team? It's hard to say. You would have to find one that has an abundance of defensemen that they would be able to part with one and not really hurt their blue line, and they need a forward. The team that was brought up was a team like Dallas. Would the Dallas Stars really be willing to trade Thomas Harley for William Eklund? Probably not. I would say more so you would be looking for a team that's on the up and up, that has an abundance of defensemen. One good example could actually be the Chicago Blackhawks. They have a lot of very interesting blue liners because they built up from that area compared to the Sharks, who built out from the forwards position. And so there's Sam Rinzel, there's Artem Levshinov, and there's Vlasic, perhaps. So they have a lot of very interesting young defensemen. The problem is, and I'm sure many Chicago Blackhawks fans would say this themselves, Rinzel and Levshinov are probably untradeable players of their own right, and I wouldn't want to move Eklund for a guy like Kevin Korchinski. And so to me, it feels like unless that really great opportunity were to pop up, I think that the Sharks would stick with Eklund. When it comes to the actual signing of the contract, yes, it is apparently the case that the Sharks really wanted 3 years for Eklund, but it should be noted that Eklund also himself really wanted this more shorter term contract. So this isn't something that the Sharks showed a complete unwillingness to commit longer term. It was something that was apparently very much agreed upon between both parties, and so this is a situation that I think Eklund, unless the right move does pop up, and I think he would be someone that the Sharks would be willing to trade, he'll probably be locked in relatively long term here for the San Jose Sharks. The next question actually comes from G. Taylor, who asks to compare the games of William Eklund to Will Smith. Now, Eklund as a player in the offensive zone is definitely much more of a gritty type of guy. When you look in the offensive zone, you're likely going to be finding William Eklund along the boards or in the corners or below the goal line, really trying to fight for space, fight for the puck, getting under other players' skins, and really just being a general hard-working type of guy to try and find the puck and feed it to his line mates. He's also very valuable in his own zone. He was perhaps the Sharks' best defensive forward from this past season. He plays on the penalty kill, and so like I said, there is a lot of value in this particular player. In comparison, Will Smith has a higher talent level, I would say, than William Eklund. Eklund's shot is just okay, while Will Smith has a very good one. Eklund is quite a good playmaker, but I think Smith eclipses him in that position as well, and generally I would say Smith has that better offensive awareness, hockey IQ, ability to really read the ice at a very high level. But at the same time, Smith is also a relatively one-dimensional player. There's not a ton else that he is necessarily bringing to the table. That's perfectly fine. There have been many successful players in the NHL who have gone on and won Stanley Cups who are much more just offensively focused players. Think of a guy like Patrick Kane or Nikita Kucherov, who are just very much indexing in that playmaking and shooting type of ability. And they are still incredible players, but obviously Eklund brings a lot more dimension to his game, I would say. What's interesting here is that if you were to combine the strengths of a player like Will Smith with the strengths of a player like Eklund, you'd end up having a pretty strong superstar in the NHL. And funnily enough, the Sharks do have a player like that with Macklin Celebrini, who has that high talent level that Smith has, as well as the tenacity and competitiveness that William Eklund has. And that's why Macklin Celebrini is indeed such a special player. I would say Eklund is the type of guy who you would want complementing other really skilled players on his line, and he can kind of do the dirty work for them and create the space for them. Meanwhile, Will Smith is the player who would benefit from having a guy like Eklund on his line. They complement each other rather well. The next question comes from Steve, who asks the infamous debate, or the famous debate, however you want to look at it. What is my opinion on the Celebrini versus Connor Bedard situation? This became a very popular debate over the course of this past season. I think because Connor Bedard was such a hyped up prospect for multiple years prior to actually being drafted in 2023 that this season, where he was expected to take that big step forward in his sophomore year like McDavid did, like Crosby did, but instead he took a slight step back, it has begun to bring up the question of, is he actually as hyped up as many people thought he would be? And since Celebrini was having a ton of success this season, it then spawned the question of, well, which of these two first overall centers is the better player? Now, it probably isn't that much of a surprise that myself, as a San Jose Sharks fan, I would say that Celebrini does get the edge for me in this comparison, but at the same time, that seems to be the popular opinion. Most people have been saying that Celebrini is at this moment a better player than Connor Bedard. Obviously, Chicago Blackhawks fans will hold out hope for Bedard, and I've seen like some public scouts still trying to hold on to the potential that they had in Bedard prior to being drafted and saying, oh, it's just a matter of time before he shows it in the NHL. This isn't me trying to downplay Bedard in any sort of way, but he is kind of like Will Smith, but just a better version of him, which is to say that he's got an absolutely incredible shot. He is able to get it off quickly and with a ton of power that will catch a lot of defensemen and goaltender by surprise. This is a player who in the future could easily be like a 40, maybe even 50 plus goal scorer in the NHL, and his offensive awareness is also incredible. Watching him when he has space in the offensive zone, or in particular on the power play, he can do some really incredible things, even at a level higher than Macklin Celebrini. But the thing is that's really where Bedard's advantages come to an end. He has this incredible offensive talent, which I said is perfectly fine. I mentioned Patrick Kane earlier. He was on the Chicago Blackhawks. They won 3 Stanley Cups with him. That worked out exceptionally well for Chicago. But the thing is that there's so many other aspects that Celebrini is able to bring to the table while also still being incredibly skilled offensively. The skating ability of Celebrini is a step above, or a couple of steps above, where Bedard is. The competitiveness, his ability to win puck battles, is also very far ahead of where Bedard is as that undersized kind of center. Also, the defensive game, Celebrini has shown a complete willingness to be really good in this particular area. I mean, already as an 18-year-old, he has eclipsed him in that position, and he is on the upward trend compared to Bedard, who has kind of stagnated in that particular area. Celebrini could win faceoffs a lot more often than Bedard can. It's basically the case that Celebrini clearly pans out as a strong first-line center in the NHL, and yet here with Bedard, people are still wondering whether or not he might be better served as on the wing. And so there's a lot of offensive ability there, but I think Celebrini in every other asset just wins out. And so if the Chicago Blackhawks were to offer the San Jose Sharks a 1-for-1 trade, Bedard for Celebrini, I would not be a person who would accept such a deal. The next question comes from Whoops Wrong Button, who asks the comparison between the San Jose Sharks offseason and the Chicago Blackhawks offseason, the kind of difference in sort of approach that both of these teams took. The thing is of course that, as we know, the San Jose Sharks added a bunch of different veteran players throughout their lineup: Klingberg, Orlov, Leddy on the blue line, Gaudette, Kurashev, Jeff Skinner at forward, and because of these names, there aren't necessarily going to be a ton of young players who can really flood into the lineup. Guys like, Cagnoni or Chernyshov, who maybe could have been ready for some NHL time, not really going to get that opportunity this season. Compare this to Chicago, who really only made a couple of moves. I think they added Sam Lafferty and Andrei Burakovsky. Otherwise, though, a lot of space has been left open for younger players, and in particular on the defensive side of things. Connor Murphy is really the only veteran defenseman that they are going to have. The other spots are going to be filled with Rinzel, Vlasic, Del Mastro, Levshinov, Korchinski. That's going to give them a really exciting blue line to watch. I'm sure Chicago Blackhawks fans are really looking forward to this next season because so much of their youth is really going to be looking to make a big impact in the NHL this season. The thing is, though, is that the San Jose Sharks were faced with a bit of a salary cap issue. They needed to spend a good chunk of money just to hit the salary cap floor, and so they kind of had to sign a lot of these veteran players, and I don't believe the Chicago Blackhawks were faced with the same type of problem. Had they been, and they needed to spend $15 to $20 million, they almost certainly also would have done the very same thing that the Sharks did. So it's kind of been forced, it has kind of forced San Jose's hand to be picking up these types of veteran players. On top of this, however, the Sharks do still have some young players within their lineup. Obviously, Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, guys like Graf and Mukhamadullin also looking to be full-time NHLers, but there is also Sam Dickinson, who will be in and out of the lineup this year. There's also Michael Misa, who likely will be in and out of the lineup this year as well. And so yes, could there be more young players? Would that be more exciting to watch? Sure, but this is also kind of the safer approach. For the Chicago Blackhawks, with their extremely inexperienced and young defense, if things don't really work out, Levshinov and Korchinski in particular did not really show like a ton of great things this past season. They had their moments, but all in all, they were very shaky. And Rinzel, while he was spectacular during his late season showing, it was also over a very small sample size. Is he really able to handle top pairing minutes for a full 82-game season? That is very up in the air, and if things don't go well for that Chicago blue line, the team is likely going to sink to the bottom of the standings yet again. And the thing is that this is now Connor Bedard's third season in the NHL, the final year of his ELC. The first two seasons maybe haven't gone as well. The first did. The second season definitely didn't go as well as he would have hoped, and if it is another kind of repeat where Chicago is right near the bottom of the standings, he's not able to find a ton of success, he ends up as like a 60-70 point player, I wouldn't be particularly happy if I were Connor Bedard with my next contract now kind of having to be like a bridge deal because I can't really sign long term because I haven't gotten the chance to show my full potential. Compare this to San Jose. I'm not saying that the Sharks won't finish near the bottom of the standings. That still remains to be seen, but with the more veteran presence there, it is a lot less volatile. And so basically, I think the Sharks' approach, I won't say it was better than Chicago, but they kind of had to do it with the salary cap situation, and it's certainly not like a terrible situation for San Jose. The next question comes from Infinity, who asks, what is the realistic ceiling for the San Jose Sharks this season? He then also brings up the ideas of if Askarov asserts himself as a good starter this year, if Dickinson is a Calder finalist, and all of the young players take a step forward. I don't know if this is like two separate questions where it's like, what's the realistic ceiling, and then what is the finish where the Sharks have all of these things go well, or if these are going to be combined. For the sake of this answer, I will combine these two things. What is the realistic ceiling for the San Jose Sharks if all of these factors do end up going in their favor? And I would say, honestly, if Askarov is actually like a really solid starter, like Dustin Wolf level this upcoming season, and Dickinson ends up being a Calder finalist, which would project really well for the Sharks blue line as a whole, and all their young players take a step forward, so that includes Celebrini and Smith and Eklund, but also guys like Graf and Mukhamadullin, I don't see why the Sharks couldn't be able to compete for a playoff spot at that point, with really solid goaltending, with a surprisingly good blue line headlined by Dickinson and Mukhamadullin, and with strong goal-scoring support from their forwards who are looking a lot better. This could easily be like a 90-point team. Will they compete with like a Dallas or like an Edmonton for the top of the table? Probably not still. They're likely missing a few pieces, but if everything goes well for them, perhaps the playoffs could be in reach. However, the next question comes from Matt, who asks, where do I think the Sharks will actually finish in the standings this season? And I'll have a video about this later on where I go into much more detail here, but I'll give like kind of my brief answer. I don't think that everything is going to go perfectly for the San Jose Sharks. In particular, I find it difficult to believe, I would love to believe it, but I find it difficult to, that Sam Dickinson is going to end up being a Calder finalist this season, and that the defense is going to really exceed expectations by such a significant margin. And so I would say a much more realistic view is to have the Sharks as more of like a maybe high 60s to low 70s in terms of point totals. I think it's important to mention that, of course, last year the Sharks, they finished, I believe, with 52 points, so that would still be like a 20-point improvement this season, but Mackenzie Blackwood had been traded in early December, and the Sharks got back Georgiev, who was a significantly worse goaltender. I have zero doubt that had the Sharks held on to Blackwood, not even necessarily for the full season, but even just up to the deadline in early March, that the Sharks could have easily won maybe 4 or 5, perhaps even more than that, games. And that would have put them much closer to the 60 to 65 point range in like a second or third last position. I have definitely no doubts in my mind that if they held on to Blackwood, they would have looked much, much better than they actually did. And so if Askarov is at least, pretty good as a starter, maybe not even Dustin Wolf level, but like above 900 save percentage, I think the Sharks could definitely hit that 70-point mark, and that is a relatively realistic view of things. Could they fall a little bit below? Sure. Could they even exceed those expectations? Sure. But that seems like a relatively safe bet, which should put them in, like a bottom 3, maybe bottom 5 spot, probably a bottom 5 spot, with maybe a couple of other ones falling below that. The next question comes from Caravaggio, who asks me, what would be my 23-man roster for the upcoming season for the San Jose Sharks? Obviously, I've had some forward lineup predictions videos in the past, but usually while I do kind of consider my own opinion in that, I try to keep it realistic with what the Sharks will actually do, which is the reason for why Barclay Goodrow always finds himself on that San Jose Sharks fourth line. But this question is asking if I had full control, what would I decide for the Sharks starting 23-man roster? Well, I'm kind of going off the top of my head, so hopefully I don't forget any players, but obviously you have Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, Toffoli, Skinner, and then I guess Kurashev as like a top 6. Your third line would be something like Wenberg with Graf, as well as Michael Misa, who I would have starting in the NHL, and then you'd have Gaudette. Probably Ostapchuk would be my fourth line center, and then I'd probably have Cardwell up onto that fourth line as well, bringing up that final position, and then my 13th forward, it would be a little bit difficult. I would go with someone like, honestly, Carl Grundstrom. I wouldn't want to have like Igor Chernyshov or Cam Lund as a 13th forward. And so I'd go with maybe the best of those kind of replacement level players. Not Goodrow, not Reeves, not Dellandrea, but Grundstrom, because he does have at least a little bit of an offensive element and brings a ton of physicality to the table as well. So those would be my 13 forwards, and this is because I would have 8 defensemen, which would be Orlov, Ferraro, Klingberg, Mukhamadullin, Dickinson, I guess Nick Leddy I would include in that, and then Liljegren, and I'd keep up Jack Thompson and then probably put Vinny DeHarnay on waivers. While I do think DeHarnay would be maybe better than Nick Leddy, it just seems as though it makes a little bit more sense and probably works better for the salary cap floor as well. And so that would be my 8th defenseman, and then of course in goal I'd have Askarov and Nedeljkovic. So it is likely differing by at least a couple names from what the Sharks will actually end up going with, in particular in that fourth line position, but not so different, I would say. The next question comes from Phil, who asks, Of the Sharks' 23-man roster heading into this next season, how many will still be with the San Jose Sharks the next time that the team makes the playoffs? Now, the first thing that we have to establish here is when is the next time that the Sharks will actually make the playoffs. It probably won't be this year, and you could definitely argue that it could be in the 26-27 season, but to play it safe, I will assume that it will actually end up being in the 27-28 season. So not this next year or the year after that, but the year after that. So for the players who I think will probably still be around, Celebrini and Smith, definitely. I would say Eklund is included in that as well. Toffoli will be on the final year of his contract, so he should still be with the San Jose Sharks. I would include Graf. His contract is up at the end of this season. He could easily get like a 2-3 year deal, so that should keep him with the Sharks in 27-28. So that is now 5 players. I would include Misa. This is, of course, assuming he makes this 23-man roster this year, but he'll definitely be there if he does. And then I would maybe include someone like Zach Ostapchuk in there as well for like 7 forwards. Other guys who won't be there, I would say Skinner, Wenberg, Gaudette, Kurashev, Grundstrom, Dellandrea, Goodrow, Reeves, all 4 of those guys. Unlikely. I could see a world where maybe they re-sign like Gaudette because his contract would be expiring heading into the 27-28 year, depending on how well he does. Maybe even like Wenberg could be kept around because I know they are a big fan of him, but the odds are rather low. 7 forwards out of like 12 or 13 with some guys who are going to be coming up from the San Jose Barracuda inevitably. I would say that's actually pretty good. It is the defense that is a lot more difficult here because I would say Dickinson and Mukhamadullin almost certainly should still be with the Sharks, but Ferraro, there's a chance he resigns, but I'm not entirely sure. Liljegren, Orlov, Klingberg, Deharnay, Nick Leddy, all guys who will almost certainly not be here with the Sharks in that time by the time 27-28 does roll around. And so the Sharks will need some reinforcements on this blue line if they even want to make it to the playoffs in the 27-28 season. You could say that like some of their younger guys will come up and fill in into certain positions, but even in like a best case scenario where Cagnoni becomes like a really solid middle pairing offensive guy, or Eric Polkamp comes in and becomes a really solid middle pairing defenseman, you're probably still missing a position on that top pairing with Sam Dickinson, who can really do some good work there. And it depends again on free agency and trades where that opens up. But the Sharks do have a lot of work to do in this position because it does seem as though there's really only like 2 holdouts from what is currently on the Sharks roster. And then in goal, Nedeljkovic will likely be gone, but Ashcroft should still be sticking around. So that is about 10 players who will be on this next year's Sharks roster who could be with the team by the time they are a playoff squad. Next question comes from Cousin It, and this isn't really a question as much as it is just a concern, which is basically that he is worried about the defensive pairings heading into next season. Now let us look on the bright side here that these defensive pairings, obviously, they don't look the best on paper, but they are probably the best that the Sharks have had heading into a season if you compare it to the previous couple of years. There is a decent amount of promise here. Mukhamadullin is looking quite good. Orlov has had a ton of success in the past. It remains to be seen how good he'll be with the Sharks, but there's a decent chance he pulls his weight rather well as like a top pairing guy. Klingberg could be able to find his game. Dickinson is a very interesting wild card. Then there's guys like Liljegren or Ferraro who could end up doing pretty well as well. So it does feel as though there is more promise within these defensive pairs than there has been in any of these last couple of seasons. And yes, it's not going to compete with any like playoff teams' defensive cores, but it should still be an improvement. The next question comes from Monkey, who asks, if the Sharks are comfortably in the playoff race during this next season, is there a possibility that they actually hold on to some of their expiring contract players, guys like Klingberg and Jeff Skinner? And this kind of does depend on what exactly the definition of comfortably in the playoff race really means, because there is a world where, let's say, the Sharks are 10 to 12 points out of a wild card spot by the time the deadline rolls around, that you could convince yourself that if we go on a crazy win streak, we could still find ourselves a position in the playoffs, but that is still rather unlikely. And I would say, like, if the right trade comes along, you probably still unload these players anyways, or at least 1 or 2 of them. However, if they are actually only like 3 or 4 points outside of a wild card spot by the time we get to early March, unless there's like this deal that you cannot possibly refuse because Klingberg is doing so well and he's at like 60 points in 60 games, and a team offers like their best prospect and a first rounder just to be able to pick up Klingberg, and you really just would be crazy to not accept that, I would say that the Sharks would probably just hang on to their team, stand pat, and see if the Sharks could actually make a push for the playoffs, kind of similar to what the Montreal Canadiens did. It seemed as though they had like a couple of rental pieces on that roster, but the Canadiens were actually in a decent position when the deadline rolled around last year, that they decided not to make any moves, and indeed they snuck into the final wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference, which was a pretty big win for them. So if the Sharks are in a similar position, I could definitely see them deciding to keep Skinner, keep Klingberg, even if they don't end up re-signing at the end of the year. The ability to compete for a playoff spot and play such meaningful games would be really good for this team. And who knows, maybe if Klingberg does do that well, the Sharks would actually be willing to give him a contract and Klingberg would be willing to stay on. And the final question here, last but not least, comes from Ponyboy, who asks, is it realistic to believe that the Sharks could be making a playoff push by the 26-27 season? And I would say, maybe a little optimistically, yes, I do think it is reasonable to believe that they could be in such a position. The Sharks, as I said, likely to finish maybe in the low 70s, early 60s in terms of, or late 60s, early 70s in terms of points this season. That would be a pretty big step up from the previous year. And I think if the correct moves are made next off season, that another, 15 to 20 point jump that gets them into like a 90 point range is very possible. This past season, or this off season that the Sharks are currently in, they made a lot of band-aid type of signings, 1-year deals, players who aren't likely to be here long term, but I think next year will be the moment for Mike Grier to actually make some pretty big splashes. They will have a ton of money to spend, even more than they had this past season, so they will need to make some bigger moves, and I think that will be the time that they actually look to pick up some guys on much longer term contracts, not just 1 or 2 years, but closer to maybe 5 or 6 years, and that the Sharks can actually begin to fill some real holes in their roster to actually get them to that point. So again, perhaps it is optimistic to say this, but I do think 26-27, probably at the earliest, is where the Sharks could actually maybe be a playoff team. But that will do it for this Q&A. This video definitely ended up being a little bit longer, but hopefully I managed to answer every single person's questions to a reasonable extent. Class dismissed.